Okay, hi everybody. We have so far talked mostly about how taxonomy works and how to make basic phylogenetic trees, maximum parsimony, that kind of thing. We've been working in this area of the Prezi. I would like to now start our unit on plant diversity. And the first thing that I want to talk about is basically what is a plant. Um, we all know that plants are important. Even if you never eat a plant in your life, which hopefully you do, um, the carbon compounds in your body were initially fixed by plants. The thing is they came onto the scene relatively recently in geologic time. For more than the first 3 billion years of Earth's history, the terrestrial surface was lifeless. Since then, we have almost 300,000 cataloged species of plants. And we all know this, but it's important to remember that not only do plants supply food, but they also, through the process of photosynthesis, supply oxygen. Um, so I don't think I'm telling you anything that you don't know. When we get into the ecology unit of the class, we'll talk about the importance of plants as as in terms of coevolutionary relationships with animals. But for now, we're just going to talk about diversity. Um, what I would like you to do now, and this is something that we're going to talk about in class um, a little bit, is make a list. So pause this video. Make a list of the advantages and the challenges of a terrestrial existence. Now, as terrestrial animals, we tend to look at the aquatic environment as sort of a harsh environment, and that's because we, of course, aren't very successful at living below the water surface. But remember that life evolved in water, and so many of the adaptations that we see in plants, as well as animals, and we'll get there, have to do with fine-tuning life histories, fine-tuning physiology, fine-tuning morphologies for the challenges of terrestrial life. So take a couple minutes here and jot down a couple challenges of living in the terrestrial environment, and then do the same for the advantages, because it wouldn't have happened if it's not advantageous. Okay. So, what makes a plant a plant? We don't really know for sure. Systematists are currently debating the boundaries of the plant kingdom. There is a little bit of argument about whether or not the kingdom should be expanded to include some of the algae. But until this debate is resolved, we're going to use the definition that your book uses, and that's the embryophyte definition. Okay, we'll define embryophyte in a second. Before we get there, I need you to be clear about some concepts. You learned these if you took Bio 104. You learned these in Bio 104. If you didn't, you might have to spend some time looking at this. Diploid organisms. Do they have one chromosome? Do they have two chromosomes? Do they have two copies of each gene per chromosome? Or do they have two copies of each gene on homologous chromosomes? The correct answer is number 4. Okay, they have two copies of each gene on separate but homologous chromosomes. So that's what diploid means. And again, if you're not clear on this, look it up and spend a little time with it. I need to use these terms. Meiosis, this is a special type of cell division And what I'm asking you here is, does it produce haploid cells from haploid cells? Does it produce diploid cells from diploid cells? Does it produce haploid cells from diploid cells? Or diploid cells from haploid cells? And of course here you have to know the definition of haploid. So you can look that up too. The correct answer here, hopefully you got it, is the third one. Meiosis produces haploid cells from diploid cells. Now, this is how, for example, you start with a diploid cell and you get a sperm cell. The diploid precursor has homologous chromosomes in it. The act of meiosis is actually separating homologous pairs, and that's why, or that's how, through sexual reproduction, we don't double our number of chromosomes each time. So again, this is probably a review, but if it's not, you need to spend some time with it. Let's go over some key traits that appear in nearly all land plants, but are absent in the charophytes. And the reason we're comparing the embryophytes, the plants, to the charophytes is because they most recently diverged from each other when you compare them to the other algal groups. You can see here that they shared a common ancestor with the charophytes more recently than they did with the chlorophytes or the red algae. Okay, you are probably familiar with charophytes. They're all over Lime Hollow. They're all over in lots of wetland areas around here. Okay, back to these traits. The first one, and this is perhaps one of the most important ones. This is the one that we'll focus a lot on when we go through the life cycles. Is called the alternation of generations. Okay, so here's a diagram of the alternation of generations, and when I go through these life cycles, I'll always start with the mature sporophyte stage. So the sporophyte is a diploid organism, or a diploid stage rather, and that's what this 2N means. And it produces, or at least cells in it produce spores, which are haploid through the process of meiosis. Okay, now, unlike the outcome of meiosis in animals, sperm or eggs, the spores of plants can be growth stages. Okay, so this is really weird because it would be like the sperm or the egg stage in animals actually being a growth stage. Okay, but these spores, these haploid spores, grow up to be gametophytes. And gametophytes can be relatively large portions of the plant's life cycle. For example, mosses are a gametophyte dominant plant. So the plants that you see typically in a patch of moss are haploid individuals. Cells in the gametophyte produce gametes by mitosis. Okay, so we produce gametes by meiosis. Gametophytes, because they're already haploid, produce gametes by mitosis. Gametes fuse. So here's a gamete from another plant fusing with a gamete from this plant to form a diploid zygote, which becomes a mature sporophyte. It grows into a mature sporophyte. Now, some of the differences that I'll highlight in the four phyla of plants that we're covering in class are the relative dominance of the sporophyte versus the gametophyte stage. We'll talk about evolutionary patterns. There's a general reduction in the dominance of the gametophyte as you go from the bryophytes to the anthophytes. So that's alternation of generations. The second characteristic that I would like to talk about that distinguishes land plants from their nearest algal ancestor are these walled spores. And I'm not going to dwell on this, but these spores that are produced by the sporophyte stage actually have a desiccation resistant coating. Okay, so these aren't seeds, these aren't pollen, but they're homologous to it in a way. They help the plant adapt to a terrestrial lifestyle by being resistant to drying out at this very critical life history stage. Finally, the third characteristic that I just want to briefly go over is this idea of the apical meristems. Apical meristems are the growth points on plants, and you can see up here that there are apical meristems at the tips of the shoots. That's what this SAM, shoot apical meristem, stands for, as well as on the roots. And you already knew this from the mitosis lab in Bio 104 if you looked at onion root tips. Now, the reason you looked at root tips to witness different mitotic stages is because that's where cell division occurs, because that's where the growth occurs. With that in mind, take a look at this picture and try to tell me what's wrong with this. The story here goes, this was going around Facebook for a little while, a couple of years ago. The story goes is that some kid, before he went off to war, left his bike lying against a tree, and when he came back, the tree had grown around his bike and lifted it off the ground by the way it grew. This is fake. Use the concepts that we just talked about to try to explain how we know that. All right, the last thing I want to talk about before we get into the plant taxa are the wider diversity of plants. I have chosen 4 of these to highlight in our class, and I've chosen them because they illustrate important evolutionary steps in the colonization of land. The phylum Bryophyta are the mosses. We're familiar with that. They illustrate sort of the most primitive land plant. They illustrate non-vascular plants. In the category of vascular plants, I've chosen 3 taxa. The phylum Pterophyta, these are the ferns, are the most speciose phylum of the seedless vascular plants. So these are plants with vascular tissue, but no seeds or fruits or flowers or anything like that. The evolution of the seed was extremely important for land plants. I've chosen phylum Coniferophyta as our seed plant, one of our seed plants that you're all undoubtedly familiar with. I mean, if you look outside your window right now, you'll probably see conifers, but you can see in this table that conifers, there's about 600 species of described conifers, and when you compare this to some of the others in this table, you can see that they're obviously the most diverse. We'll also see ginkgo around here. The other 2 phyla are not very common in the temperate deciduous zone. And finally, the pinnacle of plant evolution is the phylum Anthophyta, the flowering plants. And one of the questions that we'll discuss in class is, even though this is the most recently derived plant phylum, it is far and above the most diverse group. And we know from the previous unit, the unit on evolution, that macroevolutionary change takes time. Speciation is even when it's fast, it's slow, right? In spite of this, the flowering plants are the most diverse. And so we'll try to come up with ecological or evolutionary explanations for this fact. All right. So the next step in learning about plants is to sort of put these phyla in context of each other and talk about some of the ecological and evolutionary implications of some really key derived characteristics. And so we'll do that. You can see that I've laid this Prezi out kind of like a phylogenetic tree. So we'll go back and forth in this tree, and we'll talk about general evolutionary patterns as well. Okay, thanks for your attention, and I'll see you in class.